The SUV wasn't built for this road. It bucked over sun-cracked ruts, throwing red dust against the windows, while Kim H. Wanseok sat in the back seat scrolling through a shipping manifest on his phone, never once glancing up. To him, Nebraska was a coordinate, a line item, a stubborn parcel of land standing between his family's syndicate and a logistics hub worth more than the entire county put together. "This is as far as I go, sir," the driver said, easing to a stop beside a leaning wooden fence. "The rest is on foot, the trust that's holding up the sale. It's this property here." H. Wanseok stepped out, buttoned his cuffs, and looked at the heat rippling above the cornfield with the particular impatience of a man who has never once waited for anything he wanted. His people had already secured 5 of the 6 holdout farms in this valley. Only one remained, and its owner, according to his Lieutenant Min-jun, was a problem easily solved. "She's just loud," Min-jun had said in the boardroom back in Seoul. "Send someone with a checkbook and a smile. She'll fold like the rest." H. Wanseok pushed through the gate. The corn stood taller than he expected, planted in rows too straight to belong to an amateur. Somewhere in the middle of the field, a figure knelt with her back to him, gathering cobs into a woven basket, her movements slow and deliberate, the rhythm of someone who has learned exactly how much her body can give before it refuses her. "I'm looking for the landholder," he called out, using the voice he reserved for men who owed him money. The woman rose the way pregnant women rise, one palm braced flat against her lower back, and turned. The world of Kim H. Wanseok, a world built on hierarchy and absolute control, went silent in the middle of a cornfield. Samantha. She was thinner than he remembered, her skin deepened by the sun, a small scar tracing her eyebrow that hadn't been there 7 years ago. Her belly, high and round beneath a dirt-stained apron, caught the light. Her eyes hadn't changed. Once they had held something close to devotion. Now there was only distance, cold and total. "You took 7 years to cross an ocean to see me, H. Wanseok," she said, without a tremor, like a line she'd rehearsed for exactly this day. "And you only came because you thought you owned the ground beneath my feet. If you're tuning in from a cornfield of your own tonight, or just somewhere far from Seoul, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if betrayal, redemption, and a man about to lose everything he thought made him powerful sounds like your kind of story, hit like and subscribe now, because this one's about to get a lot more personal." He had no idea that the ground beneath his Italian leather shoes held the key to his own undoing. H. Wanseok didn't move, didn't speak. 7 years of syndicate discipline, the kind that taught him to read a liar's pulse from across a room, had no answer for the woman standing in front of him with a basket of corn and a dead man's ring on her finger, because it wasn't his. He started. "Widowed," she said flatly, before he could finish the word he was reaching for. "Pregnant. And still standing on land you sent a man to buy out from under me. So say what you came to say and get back in your car." He looked past her, past the basket, past the rows of corn stretching farther than he could see, and understood, the way a man understands a diagnosis before the doctor finishes the sentence, that whatever brought him 7 years and 9 time zones from the woman he'd once married, it had nothing to do with a land deal. It had a name, and it wasn't hers. The contract had 6 signatures on it. Only one of them mattered, and it wasn't his. He would stay in Cedar Ridge that night, telling himself it was business. He would tell himself the same thing the next morning, and the one after that. He didn't yet know that somewhere in a locked trunk in her barn sat 7 years of numbers that would end a man's career, expose a stepmother's betrayal, and force him to choose, for the first time in his life, between the throne he was born into and the woman he'd let them take from him. That story started the night he found out exactly who had written the lie that ended his marriage. And it started with an old man, a cup of bad coffee, and a confession that had been waiting 7 years to be spoken. He asked the question before Elder D-sung had even set down his coffee cup. "Who wrote the report, old man? Who put my wife's name on paper that wasn't hers to carry?" The diner was empty at that hour, just the hum of a walk-in cooler and a waitress refilling ketchup bottles by the window. D-sung wrapped both hands around his mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world, and for a long moment he didn't answer. He was pushing 80 now, spine curved from decades of standing guard behind men who never once thanked him for it, and H. Wansiok had never seen him afraid of anything. He looked afraid now. "I served your father 31 years, Sung said finally. "I have kept worse secrets than this one. But I am tired, H. Wansiok. I am tired of carrying a lie for a woman who never did anything but tell the truth at the wrong time to the wrong people." And that was how it started. Not with a confession all at once, but in pieces, the way old men give up things they've held too long, carefully, like it might break something on the way out. The memory settled like frost over smooth glass, and H. Wansiok was 31 years old again, standing in the marble foyer of his father's Seoul estate on the morning he first saw her. Samantha had not belonged in that house, and everyone had known it from the beginning, including her. She'd come to Korea on a forensic accounting contract, brought in by a foreign bank to audit a shipping conglomerate that happened to share 3 board members with the Kim family's legitimate holdings. She was sharp in a way that made grown men in that boardroom sit up straighter, the kind of sharp that didn't announce itself with volume, but with precision. She'd once caught a $9 million discrepancy, buried inside 11 layers of shell invoicing, simply by noticing that a font had changed halfway through a document. H. Wansiok, 29 then, and already carrying more weight than a son should have to carry, had watched her take apart a room full of men twice her age without raising her voice once. He had never seen anything like her. He married her 11 months later, against his father's wishes and Lady Yi Jin's open contempt, in a ceremony his stepmother attended only because refusing would have cost her standing she wasn't willing to lose. For 2 years it had been good. Better than good, it had been the only part of his life that had ever felt like it belonged to him and not to the syndicate. Samantha kept her own ledgers separate from the family's, out of habit more than suspicion, cross-referencing shipping manifests against bank transfers the way she'd been trained to since business school. It was routine. It was nothing, until it wasn't. She found the pattern in April, 3 years into the marriage, a string of offshore property purchases in Vancouver and Los Angeles, funded through accounts that traced back, after 4 labyrinthine steps, to a set of holding companies that had no legitimate reason to exist. She didn't go to H. Wansiok first. She went to Min-jun, because Min-jun managed the clan's finances, and because she trusted him the way you trust a man who has poured your tea at every family dinner for 3 years running. She showed him the discrepancy in his own office, expecting him to be as alarmed as she was. He wasn't alarmed. He was very, very calm. And that calm, she would tell H. Wansiok years later in a barn in Nebraska, was the first moment she should have been afraid. Here is the unanswered question that sat underneath everything that followed, one that even Sung couldn't fully account for that morning in the diner. How had Min-jun known, within 6 days of Samantha finding the pattern, exactly which rival syndicate to fabricate a connection to, a group so obscure that even clan intelligence had barely tracked their movements? Someone inside Samantha's own audit trail had fed him the name. Someone who had access to her private files before she'd shown them to anyone but him. Sung didn't know who. Not yet. But he remembered, with the particular clarity of a man who has replayed one night 10,000 times, the evening Lady Yi Jin summoned him to her private study and handed him a folder of photographs. Samantha, digitally placed into a meeting room with 3 known lieutenants of a rival cartel, her face lifted from a gala photo and grafted seamlessly onto a body that was not hers. "Even you would believe it," Sung told H. Wansiok, his voice cracking on the word believe. "I almost did. That is how good the work was." Lady Yi Jin had brought the folder to H. Wansiok's father first, 3 weeks before the old man's death, knowing, Sung believed now, exactly how little strength the dying chairman had left to question anything placed in front of him. And when the chairman passed, and the folder landed on H. Wansiok's desk instead, freshly grieving and drowning in the weight of a throne he hadn't asked for at 29 years old, there had been no one left standing between him and the lie. His father, who might have recognized doctored photography from 30 years running black market intelligence, was gone. His mother had died when he was a boy. The only family voice left in his ear was his stepmother's, soft and sorrowful, telling him how sorry she was, how she'd always warned him about outsiders, how the clan's survival depended on swift and visible discipline. He remembered signing the exile order at his father's old desk, the mahogany surface still holding the faint impression of decades of other men's decisions. He remembered that his hand had not shaken, because 30 years of syndicate discipline had trained the shake out of him before he ever needed to use it. He remembered that Samantha had not screamed or begged when the papers were delivered to her. She had gone very still, the way she did when she was calculating something, and asked him one question. "Do you actually believe this, H. Wansiok, or do you just need someone to?" He hadn't answered her. That was the part that lived in him 7 years later like a splinter too deep to dig out. Not that he'd exiled her, but that when she'd given him one honest chance to look at her and say, "I know you," he had looked away instead. She had been 6 weeks pregnant when she left Seoul. He hadn't known. She hadn't told him. And somewhere on a red-eye flight to a country she hadn't lived in since she was a girl, she had made a decision that would take her 7 years to explain to anyone. She would not fight a fabrication with tears. She would fight it, eventually, the only way she knew how to fight anything, with numbers, with proof. With the patience of a woman who understood that some lies are so well built they can only be dismantled brick by brick, in daylight, in front of witnesses who cannot look away. Di-sung set his coffee cup down, and his hand, H. Wansiok noticed, was trembling now in a way it hadn't been at the start of the conversation. "There is one more thing," the old man said. "The photographer who altered those images. I know his name. And 3 months ago, I heard he was paid a second time, a new commission, for a different job, and paid by the same account that funded the first." H. Wansiok felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. "That means someone is still using those photographs," he said slowly. "Someone paid to fabricate a lie about my wife 7 years ago just took money to fabricate something new. Which means whatever is happening in Nebraska right now was never about the land at all." Outside the diner window, the sun was coming up gold over a county that had no idea yet how deep the rot beneath it went, or how many families it had already quietly swallowed. If watching an innocent woman get erased by a man's silence made something twist in your chest just now, you already know what to do. Hit that like button and let it be loud, because Min-jun doesn't get to walk into the next chapter unbothered. Comment, "I see you," if you're done letting people like him hide behind good manners. And before we go back to Cedar Ridge, if this kind of story lives in you, the kind that makes you sit with it long after the screen goes dark, we've got another one waiting for you. 2 powerful novels, one that will break your heart and one that will heal it right back, discounted right now for founding members only, with the audiobook included free. The link's in the description and pinned in the comments. And if you're watching this on your TV tonight, just grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. Go on. Some stories are worth interrupting the night for. He didn't yet know it, but the rot had a shape, and that shape had been growing in the soil of Cedar Ridge for nearly 2 years before Kim H. Wansiok ever set foot on it. Long before he understood that the woman kneeling in that cornfield had already fought this war once before, alone, with nothing but a widow's pension and a stubbornness the whole county had learned not to underestimate. Samantha hadn't planned on coming back to Nebraska. When she stepped off that plane 7 years ago with nothing but 2 suitcases and a marriage she couldn't yet grieve because she was too busy surviving it, she'd told herself it was temporary. A place to breathe. A place where nobody knew her name well enough to whisper it. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that measured a person by how they showed up for harvest, not by what happened to them in a city 4,000 miles away, and there was a mercy in that anonymity she hadn't known she needed until she had it. Her grandmother's farmhouse was still standing when she arrived, weathered but honest, the way most things in that county were. She'd grown up summers in that kitchen, learned to shell peas on that porch, and when she walked back through the front door at 29 years old with a marriage in ashes behind her, something in her chest had loosened for the first time in months. Nobody here needed her to explain the woman she used to be in Seoul. They only needed to know if she could pull her weight, and she could. She always could. Elijah Rourke ran the auto shop on Route 9, and he was nothing like the men she'd spent her 20s around. No tailored suits, no boardrooms, no careful masks worn over careful ambitions. He had grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles and a laugh that came easy and often. And the first time he fixed her grandmother's old truck, he refused to take her money and told her the porch light needed replacing too, free of charge, like he was already planning on coming back. She hadn't expected to fall in love again. She certainly hadn't expected it to feel this uncomplicated. No hierarchy, no clan tradition, no family board weighing whether she was worthy of a name. Just a man who showed up on time and told the truth and looked at her like she was already whole, not something that needed fixing. They married quietly 2 years later in the county courthouse, her grandmother's wedding ring resized to fit her finger. And for the first time since Seoul, Samantha let herself believe that maybe the worst chapter of her life was already behind her. It wasn't. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March, the kind of unremarkable weekday that never announces itself as the day everything changes. Elijah had gone out to help old man Proot free a tractor stuck in the mud on the North Field, the way he helped anyone in the county who asked, because that was who he was. The hitch failed. Nobody's fault, the sheriff said later, over and over, like repetition could soften it, just old equipment and bad luck and a chain that gave way at exactly the wrong angle. Samantha was 4 months pregnant when she stood at his grave in a black dress that no longer fit right around the middle, surrounded by a town that didn't know what to say to a woman who had now buried a marriage and a husband in the same decade, in 2 different countries, under 2 very different kinds of grief. She let herself cry for exactly 11 days. She remembered counting them, because counting was the only thing that had ever made the unbearable feel survivable. On the 12th day, she put on her boots and walked out to the field, because the corn didn't care how broken she was, and neither did the mortgage, and neither did the baby growing inside her who was going to need a home that hadn't lost everything. That should have been the whole story. A woman rebuilding, quietly, the way rural women had rebuilt for generations, one planting season at a time. But 4 months before Hwanseok's SUV ever rattled up that dirt road, Samantha noticed something that didn't belong in the pattern. It started with Hannah Miller's grain elevator receiving a foreclosure notice that made no sense on paper. A balloon payment on a loan Hannah swore she'd never signed, from a bank 3 states away that nobody in Cedar Ridge had ever done business with. Then it was the Acaffer family's soybean acreage, hit with a sudden tax reassessment that tripled their bill overnight, timed exactly 6 weeks before a silent buyer offered to take the whole property off their hands, at a price that felt less like an offer and more like a mercy killing. Then 2 more farms. Then 3. Always the same shape, manufactured debt, manufactured urgency, and a buyer nobody could ever quite put a face to, operating behind a chain of holding companies with names that sounded like nothing at all. The kind of names built specifically to be forgotten. Samantha still had her forensic training, even if she'd buried it under 7 years of corn dust and grief. She still knew how to read a shell company's architecture the way other women read a Sunday sermon. And when she pulled the county records on those 5 farms and laid them side by side on her grandmother's kitchen table late one night, baby kicking against her ribs like it already sensed her heartbeat had changed, she saw exactly what she was looking at. Not bad luck. Not a rough economy. A campaign. Here was the question that sat coiled under everything, one she couldn't yet answer even with every ledger spread in front of her. The shell companies were sophisticated. Too sophisticated for a regional land grab, built with the same layered precision she'd only ever seen once before, in a country and a life she'd left behind 7 years ago. Who out here, in the middle of Nebraska farmland, had access to financial architecture that clean? She didn't have the answer yet. What she had was a choice, the same choice she'd faced in Seoul, except this time nobody was going to hand her an exile order and expect her to disappear quietly. This time she had land with her grandmother's name still on the deed, a community that had fed her when she couldn't feed herself, and a daughter coming who was going to inherit either a home or a cautionary tale, and Samantha had buried enough people to know exactly which one she intended to leave behind. She started with Hannah, because Hannah had already lost the most and had the least left to lose by speaking up. Then the Acafors. Then the Proots, who'd lost Elijah's help the same week they lost their equipment, and understood grief and theft as neighbors now, tangled together. She sat at kitchen tables across the county with a legal pad and a due date creeping closer every week, teaching farmers who'd never needed a lawyer in their lives how to read a lien, how to demand an audit trail, how to refuse a signature no matter how friendly the man asking for it seemed. She organized what the county newspaper would eventually call, with more admiration than the reporter probably intended, an agricultural blockade. 6 families, 6 deeds, 1 collective refusal to sell, standing shoulder to shoulder against a buyer who had apparently assumed rural people wouldn't notice when their land was being stolen out from under them, one manufactured crisis at a time. She was 7 months pregnant, widowed twice over in every way that mattered, kneeling in her own cornfield on the morning a black luxury SUV finally rattled up her dirt road. And she had already decided, long before Kim Hwanseok ever stepped out of it, that she was done being the kind of woman things simply happened to. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, kneeling there with corn cobs in her basket and old grief still warm in her chest, was that the man walking toward her fence line wasn't just her ex-husband arriving to close a deal. He was the missing piece of the very architecture she'd been trying to trace for months. And somewhere in Seoul, in a boardroom she'd sworn she'd never think about again, the same hand that had once destroyed her marriage with a folder of doctored photographs was now reaching, 4,000 miles away, straight toward her front porch. The missing piece of Minjun's architecture was standing 11 feet away from her, and he had absolutely no idea yet how deep his own hands were buried in it. Hwanseok took a cabin 2 miles outside town, a plain clapboard rental with a wood stove and a bed too short for him, because staying in a hotel with his name on a reservation felt like leaving a trail he wasn't ready to explain to anyone back in Seoul. He told himself it was strategy. A man closing a land deal doesn't need luxury, only proximity. But he knew, lying awake that first night listening to a kind of silence he hadn't heard since he was a boy, that the truth was smaller and harder to admit. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not with Samantha's voice from that afternoon still sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow or spit out. You took 7 years to cross an ocean to see me. He'd built an empire on reading men's intentions before they spoke them, and he hadn't seen that sentence coming from 4 feet away. It was the second morning when he first noticed it. Small, the kind of detail he'd have missed entirely if 7 years of running a syndicate hadn't trained his eyes to catch what didn't belong in a pattern. A black sedan, not one of his own fleet, idling outside the county record's office for 40 minutes while 2 men in plain jackets went in and out carrying folders. He recognized the build of the taller one instantly, a former enforcer named Doyeon who'd worked under Minjun's direct authority for 6 years. Hwanseok hadn't authorized anyone to be in Cedar Ridge. He hadn't authorized anyone to be within 500 miles of Cedar Ridge, outside of the 2 men handling his own logistics paperwork. He called Minjun that evening from the porch of the cabin, keeping his voice level the way he'd been trained to since he was 19 years old, and learning that hesitation in front of subordinates was a kind of death. "I have men on the ground here I didn't send," he said. There was a pause on the line just half a second too long. "Just cleanup work, Hwanseok," Minjun said, warm as ever, the voice of a man who had never once raised it in 11 years of managing the clan's books. "Making sure the county paperwork is clean before you close. You've got enough on your plate without chasing zoning permits." It was a reasonable answer. It was the kind of answer Hwanseok would have accepted without a second thought 2 weeks ago, back when Minjun's competence was simply a fact of the world, like gravity, like the sun rising over the harbor in Busan. But something in the pause bothered him now, the way a single crooked nail bothers a man who has just started noticing the whole house was built by someone he no longer trusts. He didn't call D-Sung that night. He drove to the diner the next morning instead, because some conversations needed a table between 2 men and a cup of something hot to hold onto, and because he suspected, correctly, as it turned out, that whatever the old man had to say, he'd been carrying it far longer than a phone call deserved. D-Sung was already in the corner booth when he arrived, hands wrapped around his mug the same way they'd been 3 days earlier, except this time there was something different in his posture. the particular stillness of a man who has finally decided to put a weight down after carrying it so long his back forgot what it felt like to stand straight. "I need to know everything," Wan-seok said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Not pieces, everything. Starting with why Min-jun has men operating in this county without my knowledge." Sung didn't answer right away. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, the way old men do when they're deciding how much of the truth a room can hold. "Do you remember the year after your father passed?" he finally said. "When you were still finding your footing, and Min-jun handled most of the operational decisions because you trusted him to." "I remember." "There was a photographer," Sung said. "A man out of Busan, went by the name Yoon. Quiet work, the kind of man syndicate families use when they need a photograph to say something that never actually happened. I drove Lady Yi-jin to meet him myself twice, though I didn't know at the time what the meetings were for. The second time, Min-jun was already there when we arrived. I waited in the car. But I saw him hand Yoon an envelope through the window before we left, and I saw Yoon count it in the rearview mirror before the car had even pulled away from the curb." Wan-seok felt something cold settle behind his ribs, the particular stillness that comes right before a man understands he's about to lose something he can't get back. "You knew," he said. 7 years, and you knew Min-jun paid for those photographs, and you said nothing." "I suspected," Sung said, and for the first time in 11 years of knowing him, Wan-seok heard the old man's voice crack clean down the middle. "I told myself suspicion wasn't proof. I told myself it wasn't my place to accuse the clan's finance director of treason without evidence, that I was an old bodyguard, not an investigator, that speaking up without proof would only mark me as disloyal and change nothing for the woman it had already ruined. I have told myself a great many comfortable things for 7 years, Wan-seok. None of them made me right." Here was the question that settled into the booth between them, unanswered. The kind that would sit in Wan-seok's chest for days before it found its shape. If Min-jun had paid a photographer to fabricate evidence against Samantha 7 years ago, purely to remove a forensic accountant who'd stumbled onto his shell companies too early, then what, exactly, had he been protecting back then that was worth destroying a marriage to hide? The scale of what she'd found in Seoul had never been fully explained. Nobody had ever gone back and asked how large the theft actually was, only that it existed. And if it had been large enough to justify framing the chairman's daughter-in-law for treason, what had 7 more years of unchecked access done to that number since? Wan-seok sat with his coffee going cold in front of him, running the last decade of his life back through his mind, like a man checking a structure for termites after finally noticing the floor had started to sag. Every major expansion Min-jun had championed. Every real estate acquisition he'd pushed through with numbers Wan-seok had never personally verified, because verifying them was Min-jun's job, because trusting him completely had felt, for 11 years, like the responsible thing to do rather than the reckless one. He thought of every board meeting where Min-jun's calm had steadied the room when Wan-seok's grief over his father made steadiness impossible to find on his own. He had built his entire sense of command on the belief that the ground beneath him was solid, and now he understood, sitting in a diner booth in the middle of Nebraska, that the ground had been hollow for years, and he was the only one who hadn't heard it echo. "I signed her exile order with my own hand," Wan-seok said quietly, more to himself than to the old man across from him. "I told myself I was protecting the family. I was protecting the man who was stealing from it." Sung didn't offer comfort, because he knew, the way old soldiers know, that comfort wasn't what the moment called for. What Wan-seok needed wasn't reassurance. It was the truth, all of it, delivered plainly enough that he could finally see the shape of the thing he'd been building his authority on top of for 7 years, a foundation of glass, dressed up to look like stone. And now, finally, standing in the one kind of heat it was never built to survive. "There is something else," Sung said, and something in his tone made Wan-seok go very still. "Yoon the photographer, he's not retired. He's not dead. 3 months ago, one of my old contacts saw him boarding a domestic flight in Seoul, carrying equipment cases like a man on assignment. I didn't think much of it at the time." But if he was paid once to destroy your wife's name 7 years ago, and paid again 3 months ago for work nobody in the clan has explained to me, then somebody out there is still using his hands. And I don't think it's finished. If watching a man realize his entire empire was built on his own wife's ruin has your chest tight right now, you already know what to do. Drop justice. In the comments, if you want to see Minjun stand in the light he spent 7 years hiding from. He doesn't get to walk into the next chapter thinking nobody's counting. Not finished was the phrase that kept Hwanseok awake until well past midnight, until he finally gave up pretending sleep was coming and drove back toward Samantha's farm with his headlights off the last quarter mile. Some old instinct from a lifetime of discretion guiding him even now, even here, where discretion had never once done anyone any good. He saw the light in the barn before he saw the house. A single bare bulb, swinging faintly on its cord, throwing long gold bars across the dirt yard. He almost turned back. A pregnant woman alone in a barn at midnight had every right not to be approached by the man who'd once let her be exiled without a single question asked. And some quieter, more honest part of him understood that showing up unannounced was its own kind of arrogance, the same arrogance that had cost him 7 years in the first place. But he thought of Sung's voice cracking over cold coffee, of a photographer boarding a plane with equipment cases for a job nobody had explained, and he knocked on the barn door before he could talk himself out of it. She didn't look surprised to see him. That, more than anything, told him something about the kind of watching she'd been doing since he arrived in this county. She'd probably clocked his truck's headlights the second they turned onto the county road. "It's late," she said, not moving from where she stood beside an old wooden workbench, one hand resting on the small of her back the way it always seemed to now, bearing weight she carried alone. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it before you decide whether to throw me off this property." She didn't invite him in, exactly, but she didn't send him away either, and in the space of that silence he stepped inside and told her everything. The sedan outside the county records office, the enforcer he hadn't authorized, Minjun's pause on the phone that lasted half a second too long, and finally, the part that had kept him from sleeping at all. Sung's confession about the envelope handed through a car window to a photographer named Yoon, and the fact that this same photographer had recently boarded a flight for work nobody in the clan could account for. Samantha listened without interrupting, the particular stillness of a woman who has trained herself, through hard practice, not to let her face give away what she's thinking until she's decided what to do with it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the dim light like she was recalculating something she thought she'd already solved years ago. "I offered you the truth once," she said finally. "In Seoul. I asked you if you actually believed what was in that folder, or if you just needed someone to blame so the grieving would have somewhere to land. You didn't answer me then." "I know," he said, and the words cost him more than any negotiation he'd ever closed. "I've had 7 years to think about what I should have said. I still don't have anything good enough." Something in her posture shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way a woman does when she decides a conversation has finally earned the next layer down. She walked to the back corner of the barn, past the tractor and the stacked feed bags, and knelt with some difficulty beside an old metal trunk pushed against the wall beneath a horse blanket gone stiff with dust. She hadn't touched it, he could tell, in a long time. Maybe not since she'd carried it off the plane 7 years ago and told herself she was done needing it. "I offered you my protection tonight," he said, watching her struggle with the latch. "Let me at least." "I don't need your protection, Hwanseok," she said, without looking up, and there was no anger in it, only a flat, tired certainty that landed harder than anger would have. "I needed it 7 years ago, when a folder of doctored photographs was more convincing to you than 3 years of marriage. I built something out here without it. I'll keep building without it. What I need from you is very different." She got the latch open and lifted the lid, and even in the poor light, he could see what was inside: folders, dozens of them, some yellowed at the edges, organized with the obsessive precision of a woman who'd spent her career finding the one number that didn't belong among 10,000 that did. She lifted out a thick binder and set it on the workbench between them, opening it to a page marked with a strip of cloth that had clearly been there a long time. "This is the audit I showed Min-jun 3 years into our marriage," she said. "The offshore purchases. Vancouver, Lowe's Angels. 4 holding companies, none of them tracing back to anything legitimate. I gave him copies. I never got them back, and I assumed for 7 years that he'd buried them the same way he buried me." She flipped forward several pages to a section marked with more recent handwriting. Dates from the past 18 months. Columns of figures she'd clearly rebuilt from scratch, using nothing but county records and her own memory of how these structures were built. "This is what's happening here," she said. 5 farms in this county, foreclosed or forced into sale through manufactured debt, purchased through a chain of holding companies. I've spent months trying to trace the capital's source and hitting walls, because whoever built this knew exactly how to make the money invisible. She turned back to the first section, then forward again to the second, laying both pages open side by side under the swinging bulb, and H. Wanseok felt the floor of his understanding shift the way it had in the diner, except sharper this time, closer to the bone. "Look at the account structure," she said quietly. "The layering pattern, 4 shells. Then a 5th clean entity to receive the final transfer. It's identical, not similar, H. Wanseok. Identical. Whoever built the architecture that stole from your family 7 years ago is the same person who built what's stealing this county today." Here was the question that rose in H. Wanseok's chest and refused to leave, the one that would follow him out of that barn and into every conversation he had for the rest of the week. If the money trail was truly the same, unchanged in its bones across 7 years and 2 continents, then how much of it had ever actually stopped? He had believed, in some quiet corner of his mind, that whatever Min-jun had done to Samantha was a single sin, contained, committed once out of desperation, and never repeated. But in architecture, this consistent wasn't the work of a man who'd made one terrible mistake under pressure. It was the signature of someone who had simply kept building, patiently, for 7 uninterrupted years, while the man whose name protected him sat 2 continents away believing his empire was clean. Samantha closed the binder slowly, her hand resting flat on its cover, and looked at him with something that wasn't forgiveness. It was too early, would always be too early for that tonight, but wasn't quite the cold distance from the cornfield either. It was closer to recognition. 2 people who had both been lied to by the same architecture, finally standing in the same barn with the same page open between them. "I'm not showing you this to save you," she said. "I'm showing you because you're the only person alive who can walk back into that boardroom and make them answer for it from the inside, while I make them answer for it from the outside, in front of this county, where it started killing real people with names and children and mortgages. That's the only kind of help I want from you, H. Wanseok, not protection. Proof." He nodded, because there was nothing else honest left to say, and reached for the binder to look closer at the numbers himself. And it was in doing so, turning back several pages toward the original Seoul audit, that his eye caught on a signature line at the bottom of one authorization document, a name he recognized instantly, because he'd seen it on syndicate paperwork 100 times before, except this signature was dated 4 months after Samantha had already been exiled from the country. 4 months after everyone had told him the matter was closed. "That's not possible," he said slowly, his finger frozen on the page. "This authorization is dated after you left Seoul, after the investigation was supposedly finished." Samantha leaned over to look, and for the first time all night, he watched something genuine cross her face. Not vindication, but confusion, the expression of a woman realizing that even her own carefully rebuilt truth had a hole in it she hadn't known to look for. "That's impossible," she said quietly. "I never saw that document before tonight. That page wasn't in my files when I left Korea." Which meant someone had added it to her trunk after the fact. Someone who had access to what she carried out of Seoul, and who had wanted this exact signature discovered, on this exact night, by exactly the 2 people now standing over it in a barn 4,000 miles from where it was written. They never got the chance to answer the question of who'd planted that page, because that was the exact moment the sky over the Northfield turned orange. Samantha smelled it before either of them, saw it. Smoke has a particular bitterness when it's coming off wood soaked in something that isn't supposed to burn that fast. And she'd grown up close enough to farm fires to know the difference in her bones before her mind caught up. She was moving toward the barn door before Hwanseok had even registered the smell. One hand braced against her belly, the other already reaching for the old shotgun her grandfather had kept mounted by the door for exactly this kind of night. "The grain silo," she said, her voice gone flat and fast the way it did when panic tried to rise, and she refused to let it. "That's the grain silo." Outside, the horizon past the cornfield had gone the color of a wound. Flames already climbing the side of the tallest silo, in tongues higher than the roofline, black smoke, rolling up into a sky gone starless with it. Hwanseok was running before he finished deciding to, phone already at his ear, and it took him 3 full rings to remember that calling his own people would do nothing here, that the men who might have helped him were 4,000 miles away, and the men closest to him now were farmers who'd never trust his voice enough to follow it. "Call your neighbors," he said, turning back to her. "Now, whoever will come." She was already dialing, standing in the barn doorway with the shotgun cradled against her hip and the phone at her ear, rattling off names into the receiver with the particular calm of a woman who had spent months teaching this exact county how to move together when something tried to take what belonged to them. Hannah. The Proots. The Akaforce. Bring water, bring shovels, bring your trucks. The north silo's burning, and it's not an accident. It wasn't an accident. Hwanseok understood that with total clarity the second he got close enough to the fence line to see the shapes of 2 men jogging away from the base of the silo, toward a dark sedan idling on the access road. Their movements too practiced, too unhurried. The walk of men who'd started fires before and knew exactly how much of a head start they needed. He recognized the build of one of them even at that distance, the same broad-shouldered silhouette he'd clocked outside the county record's office 3 days earlier. Doyon. He didn't chase them. There wasn't time, and some cold, clarifying part of him understood that letting them run now meant a name to give the sheriff later, meant proof instead of a body count. He turned back toward the fire instead, toward the growing sound of engines coming up the dirt road from every direction, pickup trucks with their beds, full of water tanks and shovels, headlights cutting through smoke, Hannah Miller's grain truck skidding to a stop close enough that its own paint would blister if the wind shifted wrong. Within minutes, there were a dozen people moving in the kind of coordinated chaos that only comes from a community that has drilled disaster into its bones, through generations of storms and droughts and fires nobody planned for. Hwanseok grabbed the nearest shovel from a truck bed without being handed it, and started digging a break line in the dry grass between the burning silo and the second one, standing 30 feet away. Because he'd read enough about grain fires in the last week of preparing for this land deal to know that a silo full of dried corn dust doesn't just burn. It can go up like a bomb if the flames find the right pocket of air. And losing one structure was survivable, but losing 2. With people standing this close was not. Old Man Prout fell in beside him without a word of introduction, an ancient shotgun-toting farmer who 2 days earlier would have run Hwanseok off his land with that same gun, now digging shoulder to shoulder with him in the orange, light like the years of suspicion between them had simply burned away in the heat. Hannah directed the water line with a voice that could cut through engine noise and panic both, and somewhere behind him, Samantha stood at the edge of it all, too pregnant to dig or haul, but refusing every suggestion that she go back inside, directing traffic between trucks with the shotgun still slung over her shoulder like she'd simply decided fear was a luxury she'd deal with tomorrow. It was Hannah who screamed his name first. Hwanseok didn't understand why until he felt it. A shift in the ground beneath him, a groan of failing metal from above, and he looked up just in time to see a section of the silo's upper scaffolding, weakened by the heat, tearing loose from its bolts directly over the spot where Samantha had stepped forward to grab a fallen hose line. He didn't think. There wasn't room in his body for thought, only the same instinct that had once made him step between his father and a rival's blade at 19 years old, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and threw his weight against her, driving them both sideways into the dirt, as a section of burning scaffold crashed down exactly where she'd been standing, throwing sparks and debris in a wide, hissing arc. Pain tore through his left shoulder and down his forearm where a falling piece of metal had caught him, not the scaffold itself, but a smaller fragment thrown loose by the impact, sharp enough to open a gash he wouldn't fully register until an hour later when the adrenaline finally let go of him. He didn't feel it yet. He felt only the weight of Samantha beneath him, both of them coughing in the smoke. Her hand gripping his good arm hard enough to bruise, her breath coming fast and shallow in a way that terrified him more than the fire did. "The baby," he said, or maybe asked, he couldn't tell which, his voice cracking on it. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook in a way it hadn't all night, one hand pressed flat against her belly, feeling for the reassurance only she could interpret. "We're fine. Get up. Get up, they need us on the line." He got up. His shoulders screamed at him, and he ignored it, hauling her to her feet with his good arm and standing between her and the wreckage for one more second longer than was strictly necessary. Some old instinct insisting on the barrier, even after the danger had technically passed. They fought the fire for another 40 minutes before it finally choked down to smoldering black ruin. One silo lost entirely, the second saved by inches, and a brake line dug by a mafia boss, and a farmer who 2 hours earlier had never exchanged a single civil word. When it was finally over, the whole county stood scattered across Samantha's yard in the gray pre-dawn light, soot-streaked and exhausted, looking at each other with the particular solidarity that only gets forged in shared disaster. It was Hannah who found the gas can, half melted, thrown carelessly into the ditch near the access road, where the sedan had idled. A detail the arsonists hadn't bothered to hide, because they hadn't expected anyone to survive close enough to the fire to go looking for it, or because they simply didn't care anymore whether Cedar Ridge knew this was intentional. Here was the question that settled over the yard along with the smoke, one nobody said aloud yet, but every face seemed to be asking. If Min Jun's men had been careless enough to leave a gas can where any farmhand could find it, was that recklessness born of panic? Or was it a message, deliberately left, meant to be found? Samantha knelt beside the ruined can with difficulty, her hand shaking now that the adrenaline had finally started to drain, and looked up at Wanciok, blood soaking through the shoulder of his shirt, where he'd finally started to feel what the metal had done to him. "This wasn't a warning," she said quietly. "This was an escalation. He knows we're getting close, and he's telling us he doesn't care who's standing here when he decides to stop being patient." Wanciok looked down at his own hand, streaked black with soot and dark with his own blood, standing on soil he'd come here intending to buy and had instead just bled on defending, and understood with total, unwelcome clarity that Min Jun had just made a decision neither of them could undo. This was no longer a quiet theft that could be dismantled behind closed doors and boardroom votes. Min Jun had turned it into a war, fought in the open, on a battlefield where the woman he loved and the family he'd protected for 7 years were now standing directly in the blast radius. If you felt your own chest tighten watching this community stand shoulder to shoulder against a fire lit by pure greed, don't just sit with it. Hit subscribe right now, because the next time these two stand in front of a crowd, it's not going to be a burning silo behind them. It's going to be a public hall full of witnesses, and Min Jun is finally going to have to answer for every single thing he thought he'd buried. And if a story like this one, the kind that makes you hold your breath and then breathe out slow when the good finally rises up to meet the wrong, is the kind of story you carry with you after the credits roll, we've got another 2 waiting for you, discounted right now for founding members, audiobook included free. One will break your heart. The other will heal it right back. The link's in the description, pinned in the comments below, and if you're curled up on your couch tonight watching this on the big screen, just grab your phone and scan the QR code sitting right there waiting for you. Go on and give yourself something good to read tonight. You've earned it. The war Min Jun had chosen didn't stay confined to fire and fence lines for long. It came for Samantha's name next, and it came through the one channel Cedar Ridge had never learned to be suspicious of its own newspaper. The story ran 3 days after the silo fire, above the fold in the county weekly, under a headline that made H. Wansiok's stomach drop the moment Hannah slapped the paper down on Samantha's kitchen table. Farm activists past ties to foreign crime syndicate raise questions. There was no byline attached to any name H. Wansiok recognized, but he knew the fingerprints of the piece the way a man recognizes his own handwriting, even when someone else has forged it. The careful phrasing that never quite lied outright. The selective framing of a marriage into a Korean crime. Family as evidence of collaboration rather than victimhood. A single blurred photograph of Samantha and H. Wansiok at a Seoul gala 7 years ago. Captioned in a way that made her look like a willing participant in something she'd spent 7 years trying to outrun. It was Min Jun's work. Not the byline, someone local had been paid to run it, someone whose name would take another week to trace. But the architecture of the lie was unmistakably his, the same patient, surgical precision that had once turned a doctored photograph into an exile order. He hadn't fabricated anything new this time. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply taken the truest, most painful fact of Samantha's life, that she had once loved and married a man from a criminal syndicate, and let the county's imagination do the rest of the damage for him. The change in Cedar Ridge happened fast, the way distrust always moves faster than reassurance ever can. Samantha noticed it first at the feed store, where a clerk who'd known her grandmother for 30 years suddenly found reasons not to make eye contact while ringing up her order. She noticed it in the way conversations stopped a half-second too late when she walked into the diner, in the phone calls from blockade families that used to come daily and now came not at all. By the second day, 2 of the 6 farms that had stood with her since the beginning, families, who had trusted her leadership through a foreclosure scare, and a fire and every quiet humiliation in between, called an emergency meeting without her, in Hannah's own kitchen, to discuss whether continuing to follow a woman with mafia ties was putting their own children in danger. H. Wansiok watched it happen from the outside, powerless in a way that unsettled him more than any boardroom threat ever had, because for the first time in his adult life, his name was the weapon being used against someone else, and there was no version of intimidation or leverage that could fix it. He had spent 11 years cultivating fear as currency, making certain that the mention of Kim H. Wansiok closed doors for his enemies and opened them for himself. Now that same reputation was closing every door Samantha had spent 7 years building, and there was nothing in his entire arsenal of power built for undoing that kind of damage. Fear had never taught him how to be trusted. It had only ever taught him how to be obeyed, and obedience was worthless here. He found her on the porch that evening, sitting alone in the fading light with the newspaper folded face down beside her like she couldn't stand to look at it but wouldn't throw it away either, because pretending it didn't exist felt like its own kind of surrender. "They're not wrong to be scared," she said, before he'd even reached the steps. "That's the part that gets me. They're not wrong. I did marry into exactly what that article says I did. The only thing they got wrong is which one of us was the danger." "I'll fix this," he said, and heard immediately how empty it sounded. How many times powerful men had said that exact sentence to women they'd already failed once. "You can't fix trust with money, H. Wansiok," she said, not unkindly, just tired in a way that went bone deep. "You can't fix it with lawyers, or with whatever version of intimidation you're used to using on people who cross you. These are farmers. They've spent generations learning that the only currency worth anything out here is a person's word, kept season after season, whether anyone's watching or not. And right now, all they know about you is a headline and a marriage that ended in a scandal nobody's ever heard the real version of." "Then let them hear it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her weighing something, turning it over the way she turned over every number before she trusted it enough to build on it. "The county council's holding an emergency session tomorrow night," she said finally, "about the blockade, whether it holds or whether people start selling out of fear. If you want to fix anything, that's where you'd have to say it. Publicly, all of it. Not the version that makes you look like a man who arrived to save the day. The real one." He didn't sleep that night, and it wasn't the fire this time, or Min Jun, or even the ache still radiating down his bandaged forearm. It was the particular kind of dread that comes before a man has to stand in front of strangers and hand them the ugliest parts of himself with no guarantee they'll want anything to do with what's left afterward. Here was the question sitting quietly beneath everything as H. Wansiok drove toward the county hall the next evening, one he couldn't yet answer. Would confession even matter to people who had already decided, based on one headline, exactly what kind of man he was? He had spent his entire adult life believing that power spoke loudest, that a name whispered with fear traveled farther than any truth ever could. He was about to find out, in front of a room full of people who owed him nothing, whether the opposite was also true, whether a truth, spoken plainly enough, could travel just as far. The county hall was packed by the time he arrived, folding chairs filled with faces he'd come to recognize over the past 2 weeks, the Okaforce near the front, arms crossed. The Proots a few rows back, old man Proot's expression unreadable in a way that hurt more than open hostility would have. Hannah stood near the podium, running the meeting because someone had to, her face carrying the particular strain of a woman trying to hold together something she could feel slipping. Samantha sat near the back, not at the front where she'd normally have stood to speak, and H. Wansiok understood without being told that she'd chosen that seat deliberately, to make room for whatever he was about to do without her name attached to it first. The meeting opened with 2 farmers voicing what half the room was clearly thinking, that continuing to stand against a buyer this well-connected, tied to a woman with alleged crime family ties, was a risk none of their children's futures could afford. There was no cruelty in how they said it. That was almost harder to sit through than cruelty would have been. It was fear, plain and reasonable, dressed up as caution. H. Wansiok stood before anyone called on him, and the room went quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when it doesn't yet know whether to expect an apology or a threat. "My name is Kim H. Wansiok," he said, and his voice, trained for years to command boardrooms without ever wavering, came out rougher than he expected. 7 years ago, I signed a document that exiled my wife from our home based on evidence I never verified myself. I let people I trusted more than I trusted her convince me that the woman who had loved me honestly was the one committing treason, when the truth is, the men closest to me were stealing from my own family, and framing her was the easiest way to make certain nobody looked closely enough to find them. He paused, and the silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was absolute, the particular stillness of a room deciding, in real time, whether to believe him. "That newspaper article isn't wrong about who I am," he continued. "I built my life inside an organization most of you would rightly call criminal. I have done things in that life I am not proud of, and I am not standing here asking you to forget that. What I am asking is that you separate what I once was from what she has spent 7 years proving herself to be, alone, in this county, with nothing but her own hands and her own name and no protection from anyone, including me. She didn't choose the family I came from. She survived what that family did to her, and everything she's built here, she built it after I failed her completely." Nobody spoke. Old man Proot's jaw worked once, twice, and said nothing. Hannah's eyes had gone bright and wet at the podium, but she didn't reach for a tissue, didn't break the stillness, just watched him with an expression that hadn't decided yet what it was going to become. "I'm not asking you to trust me," H. Wansiok said, his voice dropping lower, quieter, the voice of a man laying down a weapon he'd carried his whole life and finding his hands strange and empty without it. "I haven't earned that, and I don't expect one confession in a cold room to buy it back. I'm asking you to keep trusting her, because everything she's done since she came back to this county, she did it clean. I can't say the same for a single year of my life before I stood in her cornfield 2 weeks ago." He sat down. The silence held, unbroken, for what felt like a full minute, long enough that he began to understand, with a sinking certainty, that maybe some doors didn't reopen no matter how honestly a man knocked. Then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, and every head turned to see Samantha rising slowly to her feet, one hand braced on the seat in front of her for balance, her face unreadable in the flat, fluorescent light. If you believe a mother fighting alone with nothing but grit and truth can stand up to a machine that thinks money buys silence, share this right now, Because Samantha's not done yet, and neither is this fight. She didn't walk to the front of the room to defend him. She walked to the front of the room to finish what he'd started, because forgiveness, if it ever came, was hers to decide on her own timeline, and tonight wasn't about him at all. "I don't know yet what I believe about the man who just sat down," Samantha said, reaching the podium and turning to face a room that had gone utterly still, waiting for her the way a jury waits for a verdict it hasn't decided whether to trust. "But I know exactly what I believe about the man who isn't standing here tonight, and I think it's time this county finally sees him too." She'd brought a laptop bag with her, one she'd clearly had ready before the meeting even started, and Hannah, without being asked, hurried to set up the old projector the council kept in the supply closet for zoning presentations, its fan whirring to life and throwing a rectangle of white light against the back wall of the hall. "This is going to take a few minutes," Samantha said, opening the laptop. "I need you to be patient with the numbers, because the numbers are the whole point. They're the reason I was exiled from my marriage 7 years ago, and they're the reason 5 families in this county have lost their land in the last 18 months. It's the same crime. It just changed continents." She pulled up the first slide, and Wanciak, still sitting where he'd sat through his own confession, watched her transform in real time from the woman who'd wept quietly over a burned silo into the forensic accountant who had once dismantled a room full of corporate men without raising her voice. The audit trail unfolded across the wall in her steady, unhurried narration. The 4 Soul Shell companies from 7 years ago, the offshore Vancouver and Lowe's Angels purchases, and then, layered directly beside them, the newer architecture she'd rebuilt from county records over the past 6 months. Identical structuring, identical layering pattern. A signature buried in the account architecture as distinctive, she explained, as a fingerprint, because whoever built it had never needed to change the method, only the geography, since nobody had ever been positioned to catch him doing it twice. Hannah's foreclosure notice. The Akaforce manufactured tax reassessment. 3 more properties, each one traced back through a chain of shell entities to a single receiving account that, Samantha explained, pulling up the final slide with the deliberate patience of a woman who had waited 7 years for this exact moment, had one signing authority attached to it. A name every person in that room now recognized from 3 days of newspaper headlines, though not for the reason the newspaper had intended. "Lee Min-jun," she said, "finance director of the Kim family syndicate. The man who staged the photographs that ended my marriage 7 years ago, and the man who has spent the past 18 months stealing this county's land using the exact same stolen capital he framed me to protect." The room erupted into low, urgent murmuring, and it was in the middle of that murmur that the double doors at the back of the hall opened, and Wanciak rose from his seat, because this was the part he'd arranged, the part only he could deliver. Elder D-sung walked in first, moving slower than usual but with his spine straighter than Wanciak had seen it in years, and behind him came 2 federal agents in plain jackets, along with a county sheriff's deputy who'd clearly been briefed an hour earlier and looked like a man still absorbing the size of what he'd walked into. "I want to introduce someone," Wanciak said, his voice carrying now with the authority the room had refused to grant him 20 minutes earlier, not because he demanded it, but because what stood behind him finally gave his words weight. "This is D-sung, who served my father for 31 years and who witnessed, 7 years ago, Min-jun paying a photographer to fabricate the evidence that ended my marriage. He's been carrying that truth alone for 7 years out of loyalty to a family that never deserved it. Tonight he's not carrying it alone anymore." D-sung stepped forward, and in halting but clear English, confirmed for the room what he'd confessed to Wanciak days earlier in a diner booth. The envelope through the car window, the photographer counting his payment in a rearview mirror, and the flight 3 months ago that meant the same hands were still being paid for work nobody had explained. Here was the question that rippled through the room before the final blow landed, one Wanciak hadn't fully answered even for himself until this moment. If Min-jun had built and financed this entire scheme alone, why did federal financial crimes investigators, brought in through channels Wan-seok had quietly opened the moment he understood the scale of what Samantha's ledgers proved. Keep circling back to a second signature buried deeper in the account architecture, one that predated Min-jun's authority within the clan by nearly a decade. One of the federal agents stepped forward and addressed the room directly, confirming what her office had spent the last 4 days verifying through subpoenaed banking records once Wan-seok's information reached them. That the capital originally used to fund the Vancouver and Los Angeles purchases 7 years ago had been authorized not solely by Min-jun, but jointly, through an account requiring dual signature clearance held by exactly 2 people within the Kim family syndicate. Min-jun, standing near the side entrance where he'd slipped in moments earlier expecting to observe unnoticed, went very still. And Lady Yi-jin, the agent said, watching the room absorb the name. The murmur that had built through the last 10 minutes broke completely now, a wave of sound rolling through the hall, and Wan-seok felt something in his chest crack open that had nothing to do with relief. His stepmother. The woman who had handed his dying father a folder of doctored photographs. The woman who had stood beside him at every family function for 7 years, offering sympathy for a marriage she had personally engineered the destruction of, had not simply enabled Min-jun's theft. She had co-authored it from the very beginning. Min-jun moved for the side door the moment the agent said the name, one hand reaching instinctively for the coat draped over his arm, the posture of a man calculating an exit the way he'd once calculated a foreclosure timeline, cold, immediate, already 3 steps ahead. But the room had closed around him before he'd taken a second stride. The sheriff's deputy positioned himself at the door he'd been quietly briefed to guard, and the second federal agent crossed the floor with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this 100 times before, badge already in hand. "Lee Min-jun," she said, "you're under arrest on federal charges of wire fraud, financial conspiracy, and racketeering, in connection with the fraudulent foreclosure of at least 5 properties in this county." He didn't struggle. That was somehow the part that unsettled Wan-seok most, watching the man who'd once poured his tea at family dinners submit to handcuffs with the same unbothered calm he'd used to explain away a suspicious phone call days earlier, as though even now, even here, he still believed some version of himself would walk out of this clean. "You have no idea what you've done," Min-jun said quietly, not to the agents, but to Wan-seok, the first genuine emotion Wan-seok had ever seen crack through that composed exterior. "I kept this family standing while you grieved, while you doubted yourself. I built something that would have outlived every one of these small, stupid farms, and you just handed it to strangers with badges because a woman showed you a spreadsheet." "I handed it to the truth," Wan-seok said. "Something you decided 7 years ago didn't matter as long as nobody looked closely enough." They let him out through the same double doors Di-sung had walked through minutes earlier, and the hall stood in stunned, electric silence as the sound of the sedan doors closing outside carried faintly through the walls. Samantha remained at the podium, one hand resting on the laptop, watching the room that had doubted her 3 days ago now looking at her with something closer to reverence than suspicion. And somewhere in that shifting silence, old man Prout rose slowly from his chair in the 3rd row, removed his cap, and began, quietly at first and then joined by every voice in the hall, to applaud. Wan-seok stood apart from it, watching her receive what she'd earned entirely on her own, understanding with a clarity that hollowed him out that exposing Min-jun had cost his stepmother her freedom too, had ended the only family structure he'd ever known, and had proven, beyond any remaining doubt, that everything he'd believed about his own life for 7 years had been built by hands he should never have trusted. But even as the applause rose around her, Samantha's eyes found his across the room, and what passed between them wasn't relief, and it wasn't warmth. It was something far more complicated, the look of 2 people who had just watched the lie that ruined them collapse in public, only to realize that truth, once finally spoken, doesn't automatically rebuild what it took 7 years to destroy. Now that Min-jun's in handcuffs and Lady Yi-jin's secret is finally out in the light, comment below and tell us the truth. Should Samantha ever forgive Wan-seok for the 7 years he let her carry alone, or has some damage already gone too deep to undo? We want to hear where you stand." What that complicated look demanded, H. Wansiok understood within the week, wasn't a grand gesture. It was a decision, made quietly and kept, the same way Samantha had kept hers for 7 years without asking anyone to applaud her for it. He flew to Seoul only once after that night in the county hall, and he flew alone, without the usual retinue of assistants and lawyers who normally trailed him through the Incheon terminal like a moving wall. The board convened within 48 hours of his arrival, summoned by an emergency notice he'd sent himself, and he stood at the head of the same conference table his father had once ruled from, looking out at a room full of men who had spent the last 2 weeks watching the clan's public image unravel on international financial news. Min Jun's arrest and Lady Yi-jin's indictment splashed across headlines that used words like racketeering and fraud, beside a family name that had spent 3 generations cultivating the appearance of respectability. He didn't give them a speech about redemption. He'd learned, standing in a Nebraska county hall 2 weeks earlier, that confessions meant nothing without action behind them, and so he simply laid a folder on the table. The same kind of folder, he thought with a private, bitter irony, that had once been used to destroy a marriage with fabricated evidence, now being used to formally dissolve the power structure that had allowed it. "I'm transferring my controlling interest into an independent legal trust, effective immediately," he said. "Full financial oversight will pass to an external board, subject to the same auditing standards Samantha Paul used to expose Min Jun's fraud. I will retain no operational authority in this organization going forward." The room erupted into exactly the kind of protest he'd expected. Board members who owed their positions to his family's patronage, distant cousins who'd assumed the throne, would eventually pass to them by default, all arguing at once that stepping back now, in the middle of a scandal, would look like an admission of guilt rather than an act of accountability. He let them argue for nearly 20 minutes before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried the same quiet, unshakable calm it had carried in that county hall, the voice of a man who had finally stopped needing the room's approval to know he was doing the right thing. "It already is an admission," he said. "I signed my wife's exile order without asking a single hard question because I trusted the wrong men more than I trusted her. That failure built the foundation this entire scandal grew out of. I'm not stepping back to protect this family's reputation. I'm stepping back because I no longer believe I have the right to hold power I've already proven I can be manipulated into misusing." Nobody argued after that, whether it was the weight of his conviction or simply the practical reality that a syndicate under federal investigation had little leverage left to keep a man from walking away from it. The room went quiet in a way that felt, to H. Wansiok, remarkably similar to the silence that had followed his confession in Cedar Ridge. Not agreement, exactly, but the particular stillness of people finally out of arguments. He spent 3 more days in Seoul after that, settling what needed settling. He visited his father's grave for the first time in over a year, standing in front of the modest stone marker for a long time without speaking, understanding now, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before, that his father's final years had been managed and manipulated by exactly the people H. Wansiok had once trusted to protect his legacy, and that the old man had likely died never fully knowing how thoroughly his own household had been compromised. He visited Elder Di-sung's small apartment on the edge of the city, where the old man was preparing, at last, to retire fully, his testimony against Min Jun and Lady Yi-jin already given, his conscience finally unburdened after 7 years of carrying it alone. "I never thanked you properly," H. Wansiok said, sitting across from him at a small table crowded with tea things, "for finally telling me the truth, even after 7 years of silence." Di-sung shook his head slowly. "Don't thank me for something I should have done 7 years sooner," he said. "Thank yourself for finally being ready to hear it when it came. Not every man is. Your father wasn't near the end. I don't think he could have survived what you just walked into that boardroom and admitted." The last thing H. Wansiok did before leaving Seoul was open his father's old pocket watch, the one he'd carried in his jacket pocket every day for 7 years without ever fully understanding why. Inside, tucked against the watch face where it had sat undisturbed since the week Samantha left the country, was her old wedding band, thin and simple, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry expected of a syndicate wife, which was exactly why she'd chosen it in the first place. He'd told himself for 7 years that he kept it out of guilt, a private penance he never spoke aloud to anyone. Standing now in his father's empty study for the last time, he understood it had never been penance at all. It had been hope, quietly kept alive in a pocket close to his heart, long before he'd had any right to it. Here was the question that followed him onto the plane back to the United States, when he turned over for the entire 14-hour flight without landing on an answer. What exactly was he flying toward? He had no title now, no operational authority, no syndicate throne to offer as leverage or protection. He was, for the first time since he was 29 years old, simply a man, with nothing to bring to Cedar Ridge except his hands, and whatever trust he could rebuild one honest day at a time. He didn't know if that would be enough. He didn't know if Samantha wanted it to be. But he understood, somewhere over the Pacific, watching the ocean scroll beneath him in the dark, that for the first time in his adult life, he was making a choice with nothing to gain from it except the possibility of finally becoming a man worth trusting. Back in Cedar Ridge, the transformation moved faster than anyone expected once the federal filings went through. The fraudulent liens were voided within 2 weeks, the county court moving with unusual speed, given the scale of documented fraud and the pressure of national media attention. Hannah got her grain elevator back, the balloon payment erased from every record as though it had never existed. The Okaforce land was restored, their inflated tax assessment corrected and refunded. Farm by farm, deed by deed, the county returned to the shape it had been in before Min Jun's shell companies ever touched it, except now carrying the particular resilience that only comes from a community that has fought together and won. Wansiok didn't attend most of those proceedings. He'd learned, in the weeks since the county hall, that this restoration belonged to the people who had lived through the theft, not to the man whose family had caused it, and he made himself useful instead in quieter ways, hauling equipment, repairing the fence line Elijah had never gotten around to fixing before the accident, showing up at dawn to help load Hannah's first clean grain shipment in over a year without being asked or thanked, because he was learning, slowly, that some kinds of trust are rebuilt through nothing but repetition. He rented a small room above the hardware store in town, because he understood he had no right yet to ask for anything closer to Samantha than that, and he took work where he could find it, mending machinery with hands that had spent 11 years signing documents instead of turning wrenches, learning calluses in places that had never known them. It was humbling in a way that surprised him. He had expected the loss of power to feel like grief. Instead, standing in Hannah's barn one evening, elbow-deep in a broken tractor engine with grease staining his forearms and no assistant standing nearby to hand him tools, he felt something closer to air filling a room that had been airless for years. Nobody here needed him to command anything. Nobody here feared him. For the first time since he was a boy, he was simply present, unranked, unguarded, and it felt less like losing a throne and more like finally being allowed to breathe. Samantha kept her distance during those weeks, not with coldness exactly, but with the deliberate care of a woman who had learned that healing on someone else's timeline had already cost her once and wasn't going to cost her again. She was due to give birth within the month, and she spent her days preparing the nursery in the same farmhouse her grandmother had raised her in, occasionally catching sight of Wansiok's truck parked outside Hannah's barn or the hardware store, never quite approaching him, never quite avoiding him either. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the sky gone soft gold over the cornfields the way it did most evenings that time of year, that Wansiok finally found a note tucked under the wiper blade of his truck outside the hardware store, written in Samantha's careful, precise hand, the same hand that had once built ledgers precise enough to dismantle an empire. "The fence on the east side of my property is down again," it read. "If you have time this week." He read it 3 times before he fully understood what she was actually offering him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the beginning of anything he was owed or entitled to expect. It was smaller than that and far more valuable, an invitation, however narrow, back onto her land on her terms, for exactly as long as he proved himself worthy of standing on it. He fixed the east fence the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, and he didn't knock on the farmhouse door when he finished. He simply left, the way she'd taught him without saying it outright. Earn the invitation before you ever ask for the welcome. Faith arrived 3 weeks later, on a night thick with the kind of humidity that presses down on a county before a storm finally breaks it. Hwanseok wasn't in the room. He wouldn't have expected to be, and he didn't ask, understanding by then that some thresholds still belonged entirely to Samantha, no matter how many fences he'd mended in the weeks before. He waited instead in his truck outside the small county hospital for 11 hours, alongside Hannah and old man Prout and half a dozen other Cedar Ridge families who had shown up simply because that was what this town did for its own, bringing casseroles and folding chairs and quiet conversation to a parking lot at 2 in the morning, because a woman they loved was finally meeting her daughter. When Hannah finally came out to tell him it was a girl, 7 pounds, and screaming with what the nurses called an impressive set of lungs, Hwanseok found that his hands were shaking in a way they hadn't shaken even in the county hall the night Minjun was arrested. He didn't ask to go in. He simply asked Hannah to tell Samantha, if she wanted him to know, that he was glad. That was all. Nothing more, because nothing more had been offered. Samantha named her Faith, and when Hwanseok heard it secondhand from Hannah 2 days later, standing in the hardware store parking lot with a bag of fence staples in his hand, something in his chest cracked open in a way he hadn't fully prepared for. He understood, without anyone needing to explain it, exactly what kind of statement that name was. Not faith in him. Not yet, maybe not ever. But faith, chosen deliberately, as the first word a woman who had survived exile and widowhood and betrayal wanted her daughter to carry into the world. A declaration that despite everything taken from her, she still believed something good was possible on the other side of loss. The 2 years that followed moved the way real healing actually moves, which is to say slowly, unevenly, and almost entirely without the kind of dramatic gestures the world likes to believe love requires. Hwanseok kept his room above the hardware store and kept working with his hands, mending fences and machinery for anyone in the county who needed the help, never charging Samantha for a single hour of it, and never explaining why when she occasionally tried to pay him anyway. He learned, over that first winter, how to split firewood without splitting his own knuckles open, how to read weather in the color of the western sky the way old man Prout did, how to sit through an entire church supper without anyone in the room treating him like the syndicate boss the newspaper had once painted him, because 2 years of showing up, quietly and without complaint, had slowly rewritten what his name meant in Cedar Ridge far more thoroughly than any confession in a county hall ever could have. He didn't live in the farmhouse. That line held firm for the better part of a year, an unspoken boundary neither of them tested, though he came by most evenings to fix whatever needed fixing and stayed sometimes for supper if Samantha set an extra plate without being asked, which she started doing, gradually, somewhere around Faith's 6th month, without either of them ever remarking on when exactly it had become routine. It was Faith who changed things fastest, the way children often do, moving through complicated adult grief with none of the caution the grown-ups around her carried. She had no memory of soul, no memory of exile or fabricated photographs, or a father who had once signed away her mother's home without asking a single hard question. She knew Hwanseok only as the tall, quiet man who carried water buckets to the barn every morning and let her ride on his shoulders through the cornrows when she was old enough to demand it, who mended her broken toys with the same careful patience he brought to mending fences, who never once raised his voice in the 2 years she'd been alive to hear one. She started calling him by name before she could fully pronounce it, some approximation of Hwanseok that came out closer to Wan, and the first time she reached her small arms up toward him in the yard, demanding to be lifted without any hesitation at all. Hwanseok stood frozen for a long moment before he finally bent down and picked her up, holding her against his chest with the particular gentleness of a man terrified of his own strength, and looked over her small head to find Samantha watching from the porch, her expression unreadable in the late afternoon light. She didn't say anything. She simply turned and went back inside, and Hwan-seok understood, standing in that yard with a child who trusted him completely wrapped around his neck, that something had shifted, even if neither of them was ready yet to name it out loud. Here was the question that lingered underneath those 2 quiet years, one that Hwan-seok turned over more nights than he'd admit, sitting alone above the hardware store listening to Cedar Ridge go still around him. Was he actually earning his way back to Samantha, or was he simply becoming a man good enough to deserve a version of peace that didn't require her forgiveness at all? A life built on honest labor and a child's trust, complete on its own terms, whether or not the woman he'd once failed ever chose to let him fully back in. He didn't know which answer frightened him more. Some nights he told himself he'd stopped needing her forgiveness in order to feel whole again. Other nights, watching her laugh at something Hannah said across a church supper table, laughing in a way she'd never once laughed at anything he'd said, he knew that was a lie he was telling himself to survive the waiting. The work never stopped mattering to him, even after 2 years of it. He found something in it he hadn't expected to find, something that had nothing to do with earning anyone's approval and everything to do with the particular honesty of labor that either holds or it doesn't, that either fixes the fence or leaves it broken, with no boardroom spin capable of dressing up a job done poorly. He had spent 11 years managing an empire built on lies so carefully constructed that even he hadn't been able to see through them. He spent these 2 years learning that a length of fence wire either held the cattle in or it didn't, and there was a peace in that kind of truth he'd never once found in Seoul. It was late in the second autumn, the corn stalks gone gold and brittle in the fields, that Samantha finally asked him to stay for supper on a night she hadn't set an extra plate in advance, catching him in the yard as he was packing up his tools to head back to town. "Faith's asking for you at bedtime lately," she said, arms crossed loosely over her chest, not quite meeting his eyes. "Wants you to read to her. I've been putting her off, telling her you're busy." "I'm not too busy," he said carefully, understanding that whatever she was actually asking sat underneath the words about bedtime stories, in territory far more significant than either of them had ventured into out loud in 2 years. Samantha was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fall gold across the fence he'd mended that afternoon, the same fence line where all of this had started. "I'm not asking because of the fence, Hwan-seok," she finally said, her voice quieter than he'd heard it in months. "I'm asking because 2 years is a long time to watch a man keep his word about something nobody would have blamed him for walking away from. I still don't know what to call whatever this is between us, but I know I'm tired of pretending I don't notice it." Hwan-seok set down the tools he was holding, very slowly, the way a man moves when he's afraid one wrong motion might shatter something too fragile to survive being startled. "Whatever it is," he said, "I'm not in a hurry for you to name it. I'll keep coming to fix fences for as long as you'll let me, whether or not it ever becomes anything more than that." Samantha looked at him for a long moment, something in her face softening in a way he hadn't seen since the last gold afternoon they'd shared together in Seoul, 7 years and a lifetime of grief ago. And for the first time in 2 long, patient years, she reached out and touched his forearm, lightly, the way a woman touches something she's finally deciding is safe to trust again. "Stay for supper," she said. "Faith's making you sit through her favorite book twice tonight. You should know what you're walking into." Faith made him sit through her favorite book twice that night, exactly as promised, and by the second reading, Hwan-seok had stopped stumbling over the silly voices she demanded for each character. And Samantha, watching from the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, found herself laughing in a way that startled her with how easy it felt. That supper became a Tuesday, then a Tuesday and a Thursday. Then, sometime during that second winter, nobody quite marking the exact evening it happened, it simply became most nights. Hwan-seok's truck parked in the same spot in the yard so often that Faith started leaving her boots by the door in a matched pair beside his, without either adult ever discussing whether that was allowed. He still kept his room above the hardware store through the coldest months, some part of him unwilling to presume more than what had actually been offered, even as the boundary between the farmhouse and town blurred a little more with every shared supper. Every evening spent mending something small in the barn, while Faith trailed behind him, narrating everything he did with the total confidence of a 3-year-old who had never once doubted her own authority. Samantha didn't rush him toward the house, and he understood why without needing it explained. She had spent 7 years learning that trust rebuilt too quickly was the same as trust never tested at all, and she wasn't willing to risk either of their hearts or faiths on anything less than certainty. The certainty came, in the end, the way most true things come in a place like Cedar Ridge, not with a declaration but with a season. Spring arrived early that year, the ground thawing ahead of schedule, and the whole county turned out for planting in the particular collective rhythm that Wanciak had come, over 2 years, to understand as something closer to worship than labor. He worked the north field with Old Man Prout and 2 of the Aakafer boys, his hands calloused now in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the man who'd once stepped out of a black SUV in a tailored white shirt. And when the planting was finished for the day, he found Samantha standing at the edge of the yard, Faith balanced on her hip, watching the sun drop gold over turned earth that would be corn again by summer. "Walk with me," she said, and he fell into step beside her without a word, the 2 of them moving slowly along the fence line he'd rebuilt board by board over 2 long years, Faith humming something tuneless against her mother's shoulder. They stopped where the fence met the edge of the cornfield, the same spot, Wanciak realized with a quiet jolt, where he'd first seen her kneeling with a woven basket 2 years and a lifetime ago. Samantha shifted Faith to her other hip and looked out over the field for a long moment before she spoke. "I've been thinking about the house," she said. "It's too big for just the 2 of us. Always has been, honestly, since my grandmother built it for a family that never quite filled every room." Wanciak waited, learning by now the particular value of her silences, how she used them the way she once used a spreadsheet, laying groundwork before the number that mattered finally landed. "I'd like you to move into it," she said finally, still not quite looking at him. "Not the guest room. Not something temporary while we figure out what to call this. I mean move in, Wanciak. Stay. Build something real with us, under one roof, the way a family actually does it instead of the way we've been circling around it for 2 years out of fear." Here was the question that had lived quietly in Wanciak's chest for 2 years, one he finally let himself ask out loud in that moment, standing at the edge of the field that had witnessed both the worst and best of what they'd become to each other. Was he actually the man she deserved to build a life with, or was he simply the man who had finally stopped being the one who destroyed it? And was there, in the end, any real difference between the 2, once enough honest seasons had passed? He didn't ask her to answer that question. He understood, watching her stand there with their daughter humming against her shoulder and 2 years of rebuilt trust steady in her eyes, that she already had, in the only language that had ever mattered between them, not declarations, but daily proof, offered and accepted over and over, until proof became simply what their life was. "I sold the last of what I owned in Seoul 3 months ago," he said quietly. "The apartment, the last account still in my name. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to feel like I was asking for anything in return. I just didn't want any part of that life still waiting for me if you ever decided you were ready for this conversation." Samantha's eyes filled, and for once she didn't try to blink it back or turn away from him the way she once might have, in the early careful months of this long, patient rebuilding. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a ring that was nothing like anything a syndicate wife would ever have been given in Seoul. A simple silver band, unadorned, the metal slightly rough where he'd shaped it himself in Hannah's barn over the course of several quiet evenings that winter, melted down from the old wedding band he'd carried in his father's pocket watch for 9 years, kept first in guilt, and then in hope, and finally, he understood now, in patient faith, that this exact moment might someday arrive. "I'm not asking you to become someone's wife again the way Seoul understood that word," he said, his voice rough in a way he didn't try to hide. "I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving I understand the difference now. Between owning something and earning it, between demanding trust and deserving it." Samantha looked down at the ring for a long moment, then up at him, and Faith, sensing something significant in the stillness between the adults, reached out one small hand toward the band resting in his palm, grabbing for it the way children grab for anything shiny and new. And the moment broke into soft laughter, both of them reaching to catch her hand at the same time, their fingers brushing over their daughter's small fist wrapped around a ring built from 9 years of waiting. Yes, Samantha said, laughing and crying at once, the particular sound of a woman who has finally set down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. Yes, H. Wansiok. Ask me properly later when our daughter isn't trying to eat the ring. But yes. They stood together at the edge of the cornfield as the sun finished falling behind the tree line, the same field where a broken man had once arrived expecting to close a business deal, and instead found the only truth that had ever mattered waiting for him in the dirt, kneeling with a basket of corn, and 7 years of grief she'd carried entirely alone. The harvest that came that autumn wasn't about survival anymore, the way it had been for Samantha every season since Elijah's death. Every season she'd fought to keep this land in the hands of people who'd earned it through generations of honest labor. It was, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, about something steadier than survival. It was about legacy, a family built not on inherited power or fabricated evidence or fear disguised as loyalty, but on 2 years of small, unglamorous proof, a fence mended board by board, a ring melted down and reshaped by hand, a child who had grown up knowing her father only as a man who carried water and never once raised his voice. Some nights, long after Faith was asleep and the farmhouse had gone quiet around them, Samantha and H. Wansiok still sat together on the same porch where she'd once told him no one could fix trust with money, watching the corn move in the dark like something breathing, and neither of them needed to say out loud what they both understood by then, that the truest kind of love isn't the one that never breaks. It's the one two people choose, deliberately and daily, to rebuild anyway, plank by plank, season after season, until what stands between them is stronger for having once been broken all the way down to the ground. If this story of a man who surrendered everything he thought made him powerful, just to become worthy of the family he'd already lost once, moved something in you tonight, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is exactly the kind of truth and redemption story we're bringing you next, and you don't want to miss where we go from here. And if a story like Samantha and H. Wansiok's is the kind that stays with you long after the credits roll, the kind that reminds you love, loss, and hope are never as far apart as they feel in the moment, we've got 2 more waiting for you, discounted right now for founding members, audiobook included free. One will break your heart. The other will heal it right back, the same way this one just did. The link's in the description, pinned in the comments, and if you're settled in on your couch tonight, just grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. You've spent this whole story rooting for someone else's second chance. Go on and give yourself one too.